The story of the man who would become the scourge of God does not begin with a golden throne, but with the cold, bitter hunger of the Mongolian steppe and a crime that would stain a boy's soul forever. Before he was Genghis Khan, he was Temujin, a child born with a blood clot clenched in his tiny fist. A grim omen that the shamans whispered meant he was destined to be a warrior of unparalleled carnage. His early life was a masterclass in psychological and physical brutality. After his father, Yasuge, was poisoned by a rival tribe, Temujin's own clan abandoned his mother and siblings, leaving them to starve in the wilderness. It was in this vacuum of mercy that Temujin's humanity began to wither and harden into something indestructible. The first true glimpse of the monster within came when Temujin was still just a teenager. In a dispute over a hunting kill, he tracked his own half-brother, Bektar, and executed him with an arrow at point-blank range. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment mistake. It was a cold, calculated elimination of a perceived threat to his authority. This act of fratricide set the tone for the next 6 decades. Temujin realized early on that in the steppe, the only currency that didn't devalue was absolute power and the willingness to shed the blood of your own kin to secure it. As he rose through the tribal ranks, he didn't just defeat his enemies, he erased them. When he finally crushed the Tatars, the tribe that had murdered his father, he implemented a policy of systematic extermination that remains one of the most chilling footnotes in human history. He ordered every male Tatar taller than the linchpin of a wagon wheel to be slaughtered. He wasn't just winning a war, he was performing a biological purge, ensuring that the next generation of his enemies would never even be born. This was the birth of the Great Mongol State, a machine built on the bones of the old world, led by a man who had replaced his heart with a compass of conquest. To look at Genghis Khan is to look at a man who viewed the world not as a collection of cultures, but as a series of obstacles to be leveled. The terror of the Mongol war machine wasn't just found in their unmatched archery or their lightning-fast cavalry, but in the psychological warfare that Genghis Khan refined into a horrific art form. When the Great Khan's shadow fell upon a city, he offered a single, terrifying choice: surrender and become a servant of the empire, or resist and become a memory. For those who chose the latter, the consequences were beyond the limits of human imagination. During the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis unleashed a level of fury that suggested he wasn't just a conqueror, but a force of nature seeking to reset the earth. In the city of Nishapur, after a Mongol prince was killed in battle, the Khan's daughter demanded vengeance. The result was the total liquidation of the population. Legend says the Mongols decapitated every living thing, men, women, children, even the cats and dogs, and piled their heads into massive, macabre pyramids in the desert as a monument to their wrath. They didn't just kill, they destroyed the environment itself, diverting rivers to wash away the ruins of cities so that no one would ever know they existed. In the city of Merv, it is estimated that over 700,000 people were slaughtered in a single week, with each Mongol soldier assigned a quota of victims to execute. To ensure no one was faking death, the soldiers would systematically slit the throats of the piles of corpses. This was industrial-scale slaughter, centuries before the invention of modern machinery. Genghis Khan realized that the most effective way to rule was to make the cost of resistance so high that the mere mention of his name would cause cities hundreds of miles away to open their gates in trembling submission. He weaponized fear, turning the vast landscapes of Central Asia into a silent graveyard where the only sound left was the wind whistling through the hollowed-out eyes of his victims. The sheer logistical genius of Genghis Khan was inseparable from his capacity for cruelty, and nowhere was this more evident than in his systematic dismantling of the Great Jin dynasty in China. This wasn't just a clash of armies. It was the collision of a nomadic predator with a sedentary civilization that thought its walls could protect it. Genghis viewed the fortified cities of China as cages for the weak, and he turned those very walls into instruments of torment. During the siege of Zhengdu, modern-day Beijing, The Mongols didn't just wait for the city to starve. They accelerated the process with a level of callousness that defies words. When they ran out of stones for their catapults, it is whispered in the darker corners of history that they began to launch the decapitated heads of the enemy's own fallen soldiers back over the walls, poisoning the morale and the water of the besieged. When they eventually breached the gates, the massacre lasted for a month. The stench of rotting corpses was so overwhelming that the streets ran slick with human fat, and the very soil was turned into a blackened, oily mire. This wasn't an outburst of rage. It was a deliberate policy of calculated destruction. Genghis understood that to rule China, he had to first break its spirit so completely that it would never dare to rise again. He utilized human shields with terrifying efficiency, forcing the captured civilians of one city to march at the front of his army toward the next, making the defenders choose between shooting their own neighbors or being overrun by the Mongol horde. This created a psychological feedback loop of horror that paralyzed his enemies before the first arrow was even fired. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Khan's reign was his absolute control over information and life through the Yam, the world's first truly global communication network. His arrow messengers could travel hundreds of miles a day, ensuring that the Khan's will was felt in every corner of his massive domain. This network allowed him to manage an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea with the precision of a clockmaker. However, this efficiency had a dark underbelly. The Khan implemented a legal code, the Yasa, which was as rigid as the iron he forged. In the Mongol Empire, there was no room for error. A soldier who failed to pick up a dropped item for the man behind him could be executed on the spot. This absolute discipline created a society where, famously, a young woman could carry a pot of gold from one end of the empire to the other without fear of being molested, but only because the punishment for theft was so gruesome that death was often the more merciful alternative. Genghis Khan also pioneered one of the earliest forms of biological warfare. During his campaigns, if a city refused to fall, the Mongols would catapult the carcasses of plague-ridden animals, and sometimes their own soldiers who had died of disease, over the city walls. They understood that the invisible enemy of infection could do what fire and steel could not. This wasn't just a war for territory. It was a war for the very biology of the planet. By the time Genghis Khan turned his gaze back toward the west, he had rewritten the DNA of the world, leaving behind a trail of smoke and silent cities that would take centuries to rebuild. He was the architect of a new world order, but he built it using the corpses of the old world as his foundation, proving that civilization is often just a thin veneer over the primal hunger of the wolf. The death of Genghis Khan is a mystery shrouded in blood and silence, a final act of terror designed to ensure that even in his passing, he remained untouchable. In 1227, during his final campaign against the Western Shia, the Great Khan breathed his last. The exact cause remains a subject of macabre speculation. Some say he succumbed to internal injuries after a fall from his horse, while more sensational legends suggest he was castrated by a captured Tangut princess who hid a small blade within her robes to avenge her fallen people. But the true horror lies in the funeral procession itself. To keep the location of his final resting place a secret, the Mongol army escorted his body back to his homeland, and along the way, they slaughtered every living thing they encountered. Anyone who witnessed the funeral train, peasants, travelers, children, was cut down on the spot so they could not reveal the route. After the Khan was laid to rest in the forbidden depths of the Burkhan Khaldun Mountains, the soldiers who buried him were themselves executed by another group of soldiers, who were then, in turn, slaughtered by a third group. To finish the erasure, legend says 1,000 horses were driven over the gravesite until the earth was as flat as the surrounding steppe, and a river was diverted to flow over the spot, drowning the secret forever. Genghis Khan didn't just want to be dead. He wanted to be erased from the physical world while his legend continued to haunt it. But while his grave remained a void, His biological impact on the human race became an inescapable reality. Genghis Khan was perhaps the most successful reproductive conqueror in history. Wherever the Mongols rode, the systematic rape and concubinage of the local populations followed. This wasn't just a byproduct of war. It was a reward for his commanders and a way to cement his lineage across the globe. Modern genetic studies have revealed a staggering statistic. Approximately 1 in 200 men alive today, roughly 16 million people, are direct patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan. His DNA is a ghost that haunts the genetic code of humanity, a permanent mark left by a man who treated the world's women as spoils of war. He literally reshaped the human race in his own image, ensuring that even if his tomb was never found, his blood would flow through the veins of millions for eternity. This is the ultimate dark legacy. Not just the cities burned, or the heads piled high, but a forced genetic conquest that turned his survivors into the carriers of his name. Beyond the blood, we must look at the environmental impact of his massacres. Scientists have noted that the Mongol conquests actually cooled the planet. By slaughtering an estimated 40 million people, nearly 10% of the world's population at the time, Genghis Khan caused vast areas of cultivated land to revert to forest. This massive reforestation scrubbed nearly 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere. He is, quite literally, the only person in history to have cleansed the earth through genocide. It is a chilling irony that the man who brought so much fire and death inadvertently gave the planet a chance to breathe by silencing the humans who were tilling it. We are left with the image of a man who was less a human being and more a biological reset button. He broke the back of the Islamic Golden Age, shattered the Chinese dynasties, and terrified Europe to its core, all while maintaining a personal code of loyalty that rewarded merit and punished betrayal with the stake. He was a paradox, a man who created the first postal system and protected religious freedom, yet did so over the bodies of millions. As we look at the maps of the modern world, we are looking at the scars he left behind. The borders of nations, the languages we speak, and the very DNA in our cells are all echoes of a nomadic boy who decided that the only way to never be hungry again was to own everything the sun touched. To truly understand the shadow Genghis Khan cast over the world, we must look at the Pax Mongolica, the terrifying peace that followed the total exhaustion of his enemies. It was a peace built not on consensus, but on the absolute absence of anyone left to fight. The Mongol Empire became a massive continental-scale bypass for trade and ideas, but the toll for using that road was paid in the complete erasure of entire cultures. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, a continuation of the strategy Genghis perfected, they didn't just kill the caliph by rolling him in a rug and trampling him with horses to avoid spilling royal blood on the earth. They destroyed the House of Wisdom. They threw so many books into the Tigris River that it was said the waters ran black with ink, and then red with the blood of scientists and poets. This was the dark side of the Mongol legacy, the Great Reset that didn't just kill people, but deleted centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Genghis Khan believed that the greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy, to drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, to see those who love him shrouded in tears, and to gather to your bosom his wives and daughters. This wasn't a quote from a villain in a script. It was his actual philosophy. He saw the sedentary world, the world of cities, libraries, and farms, as a weakness to be harvested. The horror of Genghis Khan is that he was a genius who lacked the filter of empathy. He implemented a meritocracy where a commoner could rise to be a general. Yet he would use that same general to oversee the execution of an entire province. He was a man of his word, but his word was often a death sentence. We are forced to grapple with the fact that the modern, interconnected world we live in, the global village, found its first brutal architect in a man who used the screams of the dying as his mortar. He broke the world so thoroughly that it had no choice but to grow back together in a new shape. The Silk Road flourished under the Mongol bow, but it also became the highway for the Black Death, which followed the trade routes the Mongols secured, killing millions more than the Khan's blades ever could. It is as if the trauma he inflicted on the earth manifested as a literal plague. Even today, the scars are visible from space. The lack of ancient ruins in certain parts of Central Asia isn't due to the passage of time, but because Genghis Khan's scorched earth was so literal that he left nothing for the sand to cover. As we conclude this descent into the life of the great Khan, we are left with a terrifying realization about human history. We often want to believe that progress is driven by the light of reason and the warmth of cooperation. But Genghis Khan is the cold, hard proof that history can also be forged by a single, unyielding will in the dark. He was a man who rose from the lowest point of human existence, a starving, abandoned child, to become the most powerful individual to ever walk the earth. And he did it by becoming the very thing he feared. He didn't just conquer the world. He broke it and rebuilt it in a way that made sure his blood would never be forgotten. He is the ghost in our DNA, the architect of our trade routes, and the silent shadow over every empty city in the steppe. He was the great Khan, the king of kings, and the man who proved that if you are willing to be monstrous enough, you can live forever in the nightmares of 1,000 generations. The wolf of the steppe may be buried in a hidden grave, but the world he created is the one we are still living in today. The final testament of Genghis Khan's reign isn't found in a monument of stone or a grand cathedral, but in the silence that followed his horsemen. We have to confront the uncomfortable truth that he was the ultimate auditor of human civilization. He looked at the world of the 13th century and found it cluttered with corruption, weak walls, and divided loyalties. And he decided to burn it all down to see what was strong enough to survive the fire. This is the Mongol paradox. He was a man who practiced religious tolerance in an age of crusades, who elevated the poor based on their skill rather than their birth, and who created a legal system that was remarkably fair for its time. Yet he achieved all of this through a level of carnage that would make a modern dictator tremble. He believed that he was the flail of God, a divine punishment sent to scourge the earth of its sins. To him, the massacres weren't an indulgence, they were a function. If a city resisted, it was a sin against the natural order of his strength, and the punishment for that sin was total erasure. He once told a captured nobleman, "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." This psychological certainty made him impossible to stop. He wasn't just fighting for land. He was fulfilling what he believed was a cosmic mandate to bring the entire world under one sun, one Khan. As the centuries have passed, the blood has dried, and the pyramids of skulls have crumbled into dust. But the echo of his hoofbeats remains the loudest sound in the history of the East. We are still living in the aftermath of Genghis Khan. The rise of Moscow as a power center was a direct result of the Mongol yoke. The borders of Iran, the structure of China, and the cultural bridge between Europe and Asia were all shaped by his sword. But perhaps the most haunting fact is that we still don't know who he really was. We have the chronicles of his enemies and the secret history written by his followers, but the man himself remains as elusive as the wind on the Mongolian plateau. He was a man who lived his life in the open air, yet died surrounded by secrets. He was a man who fathered thousands, yet left no image of himself that we can verify. He is a ghost that haunts the entire Eurasian landmass, a reminder that civilization is a fragile thing, a series of sandcastles that can be leveled in a single generation by a man who refuses to accept the word no. When you look out over the vast, empty stretches of the steppe today, it's easy to think of him as a relic of a primitive past. But the lessons of Genghis Khan are more relevant than ever. He showed us that the world can be unified, but the price of that unity is often the soul of the world itself. He showed us that information is the greatest weapon, and that fear is the most durable form of government. He was the architect of the first truly globalized world, but he drew his blueprints in the blood of 40 million people. As we close this chapter on the Great Khan, we are left to wonder, was he a monster who set humanity back by centuries? Or was he the brutal midwife of the modern world, forcing a fractured planet to finally meet itself? Perhaps he was both. He was Temujin, the boy who killed his brother for a fish. He was Chingis, the man who killed millions for an empire. And he is the ancestor who lives on in our very cells. The Great Khan hasn't gone anywhere. He is woven into the fabric of who we are, a permanent shadow at the edge of the human story, reminding us that the dragon doesn't just live in myths. Sometimes, it rides a horse and it carries a bow. The shadow of the Khan did not dissipate with his death. It darkened and morphed into a legacy of terror that his successors, the Golden Family, would wield like a poison chalice. To understand the full weight of the Mongol horror, we have to look at the inheritance of the sword. Genghis didn't just leave behind land. He left behind a manual for planetary subjugation. His grandsons, like Hulagu and Batu, didn't just follow in his footsteps. They tried to outdo the grandfather of blood. When the Mongols turned their gaze toward Europe, they weren't just an army. They were a demographic apocalypse. At the Battle of Legnica, the Mongols defeated the combined chivalry of Europe and filled 9 large sacks with the ears of the fallen knights. This wasn't just trophy hunting. It was the Mongol way of bookkeeping, a grisly audit of death. They treated the entire continent of Europe like a giant hunting ground, utilizing the nerj, a massive coordinated hunting circle used to trap animals, but applying it to human populations. They would drive tens of thousands of people into a central killing zone, narrowing the circle over weeks until the prey, the men, women, and children of entire provinces, was concentrated and ready for the final, systematic slaughter. This was the terrifying perfection of the Mongol hunt. They saw no difference between a wolf and a villager. This brings us to the most chilling realization of the Genghis legacy, the sheer indifference of his power. Most conquerors in history wanted to be loved, or at least understood. Genghis and his line didn't care. They viewed themselves as the inevitable will of the eternal blue sky. If you died, it was because you were destined to die. If they conquered, it was because it was preordained. This lack of human ego made them far more dangerous than any tyrant driven by mere vanity. They didn't want to convert you to their religion. They didn't even care if you spoke their language. They simply wanted your resources, your labor, and your absolute submission. If you provided those, you might live in a state of Mongol peace, where the laws were so strict that a man could leave a bag of jewels on the road and find it there the next day. But that peace was the peace of the graveyard. It was a world where human life had been devalued to the point of being a mere statistic in the Khan's great ledger. We are talking about a regime that during the siege of Kaffa took the bodies of their own men who had died of the Black Death and used catapults to launch them into the city, effectively triggering the pandemic that would wipe out a third of Europe. Genghis Khan's legacy was the first globalized disaster, a chain reaction of fire, plague, and steel that proved just how interconnected and how fragile the human race truly is. As we look at the ruins of the civilizations he touched, the shattered irrigation systems of Mesopotamia that never recovered, the hollowed-out cities of the Silk Road, the truncated dynasties of the East, we realize that Genghis Khan was the ultimate great filter. He was the test that the world failed. He represents the moment when the primitive, raw power of the nomad overwhelmed the sophisticated, fragile systems of the settled world. And yet, we cannot look away. We are fascinated by him because he represents the absolute limit of human potential, stripped of all morality. He is the answer to the question, what could one person achieve if they were truly, completely unafraid to be a monster? The answer is that they could change the weather, rewrite the DNA of the species, and silence the world for 100 years. As the dust of the steppe settles over his hidden, river-drowned grave, we are left with the cold comfort that such a man only comes once in a millennium. But the blueprint he left behind, the use of mass terror, the weaponization of information, and the total mobilization of a society for war, is still sitting on the desk of every power-hungry soul who dreams of greatness. The Great Khan is dead, but the Khanate of the mind is still very much alive. We live in a world he broke, and in the cracks of that broken world, his shadow still grows.